H-2B program is the seasonal labor program for everything other than agriculture. So they're using it in a manufacturing setting. Typically, that program's seasonality is determined by the weather, meaning it's primarily a spring through fall program. But there are industries like theirs where it's actually customer demand yeah, well, I'm sure that it takes some effort to convince the Department of Labor that what you're doing is what they think you're doing and are allowing you to do to some extent. We have to do that for a lot of our clients. I've just been working with some people in Phoenix and trying to make the case that construction in Phoenix is seasonal. The good news is they're part of a national company with locations all over the country. So there are places where their business is seasonal, and the Department of Labor hasn't noticed that some of that's going on in places that can build houses year-round. So you probably have some of the same games to play. The good news is that both in H-2A and in H-2B and about 93% of workers coming into those programs come out of Mexico, and the other 79 countries from which they can come are only that remaining 7%. So this past year has not been too bad that way. And of course, the TN program is exclusively Mexicans and Canadians. And from our perspective, essentially it's a Mexican program because Canadians can actually just walk up to the border post and get a visa. Mexicans have to work at it. That's why we get involved in it. Well, the H-2A program goes back to essentially World War II when it was called the Braceros program, when during World War II, virtually every able-bodied American male and many able-bodied American females left the farms to go fight the war, okay? And when the war ended, a lot of those folks came back to the country but didn't come back to farming. They took advantage of the GI Bill and went out and became other things. So during World War II, we eventually brought in about 2 million people from Mexico to work on farms in certain states of the country, primarily south and the west. And at the end of the war, many of them stayed. About 1954, we went through one of those cranky times when we decided we didn't need you guys anymore, put them on white buses, drove them across the border, and dropped them off. Of course, most of them just came right on back. There wasn't much of a border back then. Finally, about 1986, President Reagan and I think at the time, Democratic Congress actually did manage to get their heads together and create a number of labor-related bits of legislation, most of which have been helpful to agriculture, but basically solidified the old Braceros program as what we now know as H-2A. They also basically solidified the H-2B program, which meets the seasonal labor needs of everyone except agriculture. H-2A is ag, H-2B is everything else. Primarily the landscaping industry, the construction industry, hospitality, the guys that run carnivals of all things, seafood processing, any business that is seasonal but not truly agricultural, okay? The building of, what do you call them? Slats, okay. I didn't know what a slat was till I came to my first pork meeting, but apparently it's very important to your business in a number of ways. Okay, so the primary problem for your industry as well as a number of others, or your sector of agriculture with the H-2A program, is that it is only available, generally speaking, to seasonal employers, okay? When Congress created, for all intents and purposes, the H-2A program in 1986, at that point, if you could offer year-round employment, you did not need the government's help with labor. That was their view, and at that time, it was largely true, okay? What has happened, though, is over time, the needs of agriculture have grown, but the program has not, okay? So we are still stuck with it primarily being available only to seasonal employers. That season is a maximum of 10 months. Then the workers have to leave your employer for 2, then come back again, work another 10, that other 2 off, and basically, if they behave themselves and you behave yourself, they can do that the rest of their working lives. We've been in business since 1995, crossed our workers in 1996, and we have a handful of customers that have been doing this ever since that. They were our first clients, and they're still doing this thing. We have a nursery grower who's also a tree fruit grower not far from us in Virginia that is now employing the 3rd generation of some families in this program. Big user of the program, obviously very satisfying. Okay? So how does that help a business like yours that is essentially non-seasonal? And we'll talk about what the possible exceptions are. I'm hoping you guys will be able to speak to some of those things. We're not doing any business in pork right now, but we do a lot of business in another industry that has the same problems. Basically, dairy cattle and to some extent beef cattle. And we've been able to help dairies in 3 ways, and only you guys can tell me whether it can be of any help to you all. One is organic dairies do a drying out or a laying off of their cattle for a piece of each year. And during that time, they're basically just out in the pasture, and the dairies can do without their staff. They're not making any milk during this time period. Okay? So they're able to staff up with H2A. We have a dairy client down about as far in Texas, south in Texas as you can go and not be in Mexico, who, because they want no calves being born in July and August of each year because of the heat, they've basically built themselves a 10-month program each year. They've been using this program now for a dozen or more years. But every year, they have to do a filing 3/4 of an inch thick to prove to the Department of Labor that they actually are who they say they are, doing what they say they're doing, to prove that they really are a seasonal dairy. The third way is much more common and could theoretically, well, we've already heard one employer here tell us that it's worked for them. That is that, dairies also are cutting their own hay, chopping their own silage, basically doing feed crop work during the summer season or spring through early fall season. And they can use H2A workers for seasonal activities on an otherwise non-seasonal business. The good news is that, and we'll talk about whether y'all have ever had to actually justify doing this, but while they're there doing the seasonal activities, if you need them to milk a cow or whatever it is they might do for you, they can do that too, even though they're primarily there for the seasonal activities. So basically the milking parlors get some relief by the guys that are actually there to do other things. But we're talking about now about what they call corresponding employment, okay? During the Obama administration, the regulations, they didn't change, but the interpretation of the regulations changed. It used to be that you could segregate your H2A workforce from your U.S. workforce with the terminology substantially different work, okay? And we can still do that in the H2B world. Somewhere along the way, the H2A inspectors, the regulators, said if any U.S. worker is doing any of the tasks listed in the job order for an H2A worker, from that point on, that U.S. worker has to be paid the H2A wage and potentially get the other H2A benefits. And that can be a pretty meaningful raise for somebody that may or may not actually deserve it. Can any of the people here that are not doing it see how it could be helpful to you? Do you have any ability, are there any quote-unquote organic growers in the room that do something different during some part of the year than you do in other parts of the year? So probably can't do much good for any of you all. Any whose seasonality could be determined by the weather. Are there things that you do more of during certain parts of the year than others? And could theoretically use H2A to beef you up. I shouldn't use a beef word around here, should I? Pork you up? Okay, so probably in this, just doesn't happen to be anybody in this room that can be helped by those things, but sort of stick in the back of your mind that there's that potential out there, okay? So we'll touch very briefly on H2B. If you're doing something else, okay, you may be here because you're a pork producer, but you may be doing some other things as well. In their case, building slats. We find in a lot of the sectors that we do business in, probably the best example is the tree fruit guys. They are agricultural when they are growing apples, but they can become non-agricultural when they start processing them, okay? Now, if they're processing only apples that they grew, they can continue to use the same guys in H2A. But if they become a processor to the world or to their community, that takes them out of the realm of agriculture and they have to use the other program. So H2B is very much like H2A, but much more problematic in a way that ladies over here touched on, in that when Congress created this program in 1986, they determined the need for visas to be 66,000, okay? That is, and has been since at least 2007, about a third of what's needed. So a prospective user of the H-2B program can do a filing that was timely, perfect, accurate, and should have gotten visas. And 2 out of 3 of those people who have sent those applications are not going to get any workers. They've not gotten caught by this, but they easily could have, and it could still happen. Now, Congress came back and gave us some additional visas. Homeland Security issued us some of those. So by the time this year's season was over with, we were able to meet the needs of about 2 out of 3 of the people who should have been able to get H-2B workers. And that's, I'm not talking about Moss so much now, but the whole of our industry. We were able to help about 2 out of 3. But a third of legitimate prospective users of that program ended up not getting any workers this year. And that can include people who've gotten those same workers back year after year after year, but all of a sudden this year they could not because the cap was reached before they got visas. It's really a sad situation. If you're doing something that is seasonal, non-agricultural, and you want to talk about H-2B, reach out to me, and I won't sugarcoat it. I'll tell you just how good or bad it actually is. You can decide whether it's of any use to you. Okay. The next one I want to take a few minutes to talk about, we have several people in here I think that are using this, is the TN visa program. Everybody, I'm sure, probably because you're selling through this program and buying through it as well, is familiar with the NAFTA Accords, okay? NAFTA was developed in the 90s to make easier the movement of goods and services between the 3 North American countries, Canada, United States, Mexico. Well, buried in it was a visa category called TN, which we believe stands for Trade NAFTA, but nobody seems to remember why they called it TN. And that basically allows for the easier movement of professionals among the 3 North American countries. You need to think about this in terms of people that are a scale above your average agricultural worker whose job it is to weed an onion patch or scoop manure or whatever. The idea is this is the person at the next level up, okay? In theory, they have earned in their home country, or even in some cases earned it here, even though they were national of another country, have earned essentially a bachelor's degree. Now, there are specific categories where it doesn't have to be a bachelor's. There are some where we're able to make the case for it being the equivalent of that. The best example that we have was that we have a client up in northeastern Pennsylvania, who is primarily a grower of produce, but they also evolve towards having a farm stand, a farm market, eventually a cafe, and eventually a country inn on their property. And just sort of serendipitous, one of their H-2A workers could not find a job in his industry, which was culinary arts. He was a school-trained chef, okay? And just couldn't find that work, so he took a job in this country working as a farm worker. Well, the employer came to us and started scratching. They said, what can we do with this guy? There's got to be something. Well, because he was a Mexican citizen, and he had this folder full of classes that he'd gone to, certificates that he'd earned, we were able to make the case for him having the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. So now for the last 3 years, he's come up here as a TN visa holder, and he runs their country inn, he runs their cafe, runs their farm stand, okay? And I mean, it's a godsend for them because they could not find anybody that wanted to do this, primarily because it was, generally speaking, seasonal in nature. It revolved around the work of the farm. They weren't able to staff it year-round, and he's happy to go back home for a couple of months each year. So the TN program actually allows these guys to stay here. They don't have to go home, but they can. Are you all using your TNs year-round, or you just you keep them here? Okay, all right. Are they going back every year to re-up?
It varies by
Yeah.
how long they're issued, but most of them will actually take a month's vacation.
And then while they're there, stop back by the consulate. Okay, that's the smart way of handling that. Okay, so we've not done a lot of this. We haven't really even done any in the pork industry. We have started doing some for our folks, our friends in the dairy industry. They figured this thing out several years ago and have been using it with good success. And basically what they're doing, there are a number of degree categories that somebody can earn and be eligible for this program. And one of them is veterinarian, okay? Now, what they actually have, they are not a veterinarian the way we would think of it. They are what we would consider a vet tech, okay? They can do hoof management. They can do artificial insemination. They can do immunizations. They can look at an animal and know when the real vet's got to come in and take a look at them, that sort of thing. And while they're at it, at least in the cattle industry, they are serving as herdsmen. They're doing everything else. But it's those technical skills that are basically allowing them to get this visa and then come in and do everything else. The dairy industry has expanded beyond that in very interesting ways. They are now bringing in guys that have an engineering degree of one kind or another to do all their construction on their farms. They need to build, they need to build a new, whatever, the Saudi style or the Arizona style sheds that the cattle are kept in. And they'll use these TN visa holders that have the equivalent of an engineering bachelor's degree, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, whatever, and are putting them to work in those jobs, basically working for the dairy but doing mechanical stuff, okay? An option that you guys might want to look at as well if you're growing and building all the time and having a hard time finding somebody to do that work for you. Okay, so here's how the TN thing would work. You would look at the job that needs to be done and come up with a job description that is as technical as possible. And that's what I mean by that basically is you're not going to say in that job description, this guy's primary job is to feed pigs and clean the manure out from under them. They will do that. They're coming up here to do artificial insemination, immunizations, hoof management, all of these other things, and be considered herders. That's what's bringing them up here. That's what they learned in that Mexican college to do, and that's that skill set that allows them to get that visa and come work for you, but happily do everything else. It's no different than you all as owners of these businesses are, of these farms are. I mean, you'll shovel manure when you have to, but you got a whole lot of other stuff that you have to do. These guys are coming up here knowing that they're going to do whatever it takes to make the farm successful and be, a happy employee of yours. The good news is that you can get them. The additional good news is that you can get them for a lot less than you would have to pay an American to do those jobs. Even though they've earned a bachelor's degree in their country, they can still make 10 times that up here and still be an employee that you can afford. Those that are using the TN now, how do your experiences match with my impressions as to how it should be working for you? How's it? What's it doing for you all?
We've been using TNs. We don't usually need one of these. We've been using TNs for a long time. I've been with LB Pork for 8 years, so I've been using it since then. Our biggest problem, we're a smaller company, so it's recruitment. I do the paperwork and stuff myself, and it's been pretty easy as long as I can get embassy appointments, which that's getting better. The problem is sometimes they might get a crabby person in the embassy, and then they got to go back again. And we use the animal scientist because we don't manage our sow farms. We do wean to finish, so animal breeder doesn't really fit. And then we've done some with the engineering for like in our mill, those types of things. I've had one that had an agronomy degree, but now I just tried to get another one on an agronomy degree, and at the embassy they said, well, that doesn't fit with livestock. But in the agronomy degree in Mexico, they take livestock courses. So he's going to go back and plead his case again and try again. Have you had people use the agronomy in livestock?
We have had our clients have their people denied the first time around for some reason. We're pretty good at making sure that's not going to happen, but it does still happen. But I don't think we've ever had anybody that was permanently denied. We've been able to answer those questions, let the consular official think they're actually doing a good job of this, and ultimately still issuing the visa. The problem is that it involves delays. If you're dealing with the United States government, learn to expect delays, okay? Even in a non-COVID year, there's going to be times when it's just not going to happen as fast as you want it to do. But for the TN guys, not really looking at seasonality. You get them and just put them to work as soon as you can and hope for the best. And she made a really good point about not focusing on one particular degree, even though somebody got their degree in crop science, okay? They had to learn a whole bunch of other stuff. So you basically are going to provide the consular officer with their college transcript that we translate from Spanish into English and prove to that consular officer that despite what those two words are on the diploma, their skills are actually well beyond that. And that even goes so far as to what would appear on paper to be complete mismatches. We tend to require our employers to have a pretty thorough interview process, at least by Skype, and potentially even bringing them up here on a tourist visa for an interview to see if they really like them. And they'll bring in a half a dozen guys, and one guy stands head and shoulders above the rest, but his degree is different, okay? But maybe he's got some experiences beyond his degree that can make the difference. Our job is to make the consular officer understand that this person is right for the job, regardless of what his paperwork says. And we've managed to do it in some pretty weird places. We're helping a company down in Texas who basically is in the oil field service industry. And they basically send teams out to swap out huge valves and other mechanical equipment like that, bring it back where there's another team that's going to basically rebuild that piece of equipment to spec, and then put it back in inventory and send it back out again. And so we've got civil engineers, mechanical engineers, other kinds of technicians. Their operation is virtually entirely staffed with TN workers because they couldn't get anybody else to do that work. I mentioned the one that's doing the work in the bed and breakfast kind of thing. We've got people from Mexico coming up to be, well, it's amazing the things that they can do. There's a CPA in Phoenix that came up originally on a TN visa and basically was helping this US-based accountant firm doing business with transnational companies, and they were able to help them because they had this person who understood Mexican tax law, but could help them apply it from their offices in Phoenix. Of course, she met and married an American guy, so the visa problems all went away. But there's an amazing number of niches where this can work. And it is working for people in your industry. You've heard that. It can work for others in this industry. But basically, you're looking at a process where you write the job description, we translate it, we go to the universities in Mexico, we go to the Mexican federal government that has offices. They have essentially a placement office for all of Mexico the way an individual college up here might have a placement office. And they do the matchmaking. They send you resumes and diplomas and other, whatever documentation they can to show what this person has done and can do. We translate that into English for you, okay, and then we start the matchmaking process. We'll have you interview this person at least by Skype so that you know that you're looking at the person whose paperwork this is, trying to make it a real match, do a real interview. You may want to bring them up here and show them around and see if they're really going to like this stuff. And unlike the H-2 programs, the Department of Labor never touches this program. Department of Homeland Security only barely touches this program. It's run almost entirely by the State Department. So basically, our whole focus is on convincing the consular officer on the day they have the interview that this is a match made in heaven. That's probably the program of best use to you, but we still have about 20 minutes, so let's talk about some of the others. Yes, sir?
Is there a predetermined pay scale?
No, sir. I should have mentioned that. There is no predefined pay scale. There is a thing called the OES Wage Library, which lists every job that somebody might have in this country, and a 4-stage wage scale in that. We have to use that in the H-2B world. The third level in that is the ends up being the H-2B wage. But in TN, it's a negotiation, like hiring anybody in this country is. You and the prospective employee decide how much he needs to be paid. You and the employee, prospective employee, decide whether or not he gets a place to live, whether or not he gets a car, how often he gets to go back home, all of these things. It's a negotiation, just like that guy that's coming to you from an ag school here in this country. The consular officer is going to look at it and see if it makes sense. And what I would say to you is that the wages are going to make sense to them are going to be at the upper end of that scale, but you're still talking about something that's going to be in the realm of $20 an hour, okay? And the likelihood that you're going to be paying that U.S. college graduate 2 to 3 times that for the same skill set and work. So it's more than the H-2s by a lot, but less than what you're paying other quote-unquote white-collar workers in this country. And the government does not define it, if it quote-unquote makes sense on that day. Likewise, this program requires those people to be bilingual, but it's never been defined. They're not tested. So it comes down to the judgment of the consular officer on that day as to whether he speaks enough English to be able to do this thing. One of the ways that we've been using a lot of these folks is not just their technical expertise, but in theory they are suitable for frontline managers and basically serving as the middleman between a Hispanic, completely non-English speaking workforce and a English-speaking, non-Spanish speaking management team. And these people can be that frontline supervisor that speaks both languages. Not guaranteed, but
32% of our leads managers are TNs.
okay, did you all hear that? Okay, so any questions about TN? And then we're going to touch on a few other things. Yes, sir.
In our program, the TN managers seem to want to bring their family in shortly. How difficult is it to bring the family in?
It is not difficult for the TNs. You can do that. I believe that they're still coming up here on what's called an H-4 visa. That visa generally allows them to be here, but it's not a work visa. They're coming up here as family, and if they want to work, they've got to get the other work visa, whether it's H-2A, H-2B, TN, whatever, in order to actually work. And we've done that. We helped a South African family that started coming over here on an H-4 visa with the guy that was essentially the foreman for this custom harvesting operation. And they came first to be family, but his wife decided she wanted to teach in the public schools, in this case up in Minnesota. And so we swapped her over to a visa where she could do that. One of the sons, when he hit 18, wanted to go out with the crews to do the harvesting work, so we got him switched over to an H-2A visa. So
The H-4 is with the H-2A program, the TB is with the
TE? Okay. All right. So you can do it, and it ought to be easier. I don't know whether I would try to do it the first time around, but that's something that you all can collectively figure out. There's nothing that says that they can't. In the H-2 world, they're not generally going to be able to come here with a family unless they've, for a number of years, come up here, played by the rules, gone back home on time, and then finally want to bring their family up here. No new H-2A workers, H-2B workers are going to get the family up here the first time. Just isn't going to happen. All right, let's talk about J1. You guys are doing J1, right? No, you are, all right? And you are. J1 is a program run by the State Department. That's the other good news. Department of Labor is not involved. Homeland Security is only involved in terms of doing background checks on people. J1 is a student and intern program. Essentially, in your case, let's say that somebody in, I don't know, Ukraine wants to someday take over from his family a hog farm there, okay? And what he wants to do is come to the United States and spend a year seeing how you do it, so he can eventually take that knowledge back to his country and do a better job of running his hog farm over there, okay? It's in a way, it's kind of like these other programs where they're coming up to benefit you in certain ways, but the ultimate goal of the program is to benefit them once they go back home again. I was told once, and I thought this was pretty smart, that the best employer of J1 visa holders is a high school teacher, okay? Because that's the goal of this thing, is to teach those people how to work in and run this business so they take that expertise back with them. In theory, they should be doing everything. While they're here, they should be spending some time in the business office. They should spend some time out selling whatever it is that you're selling to your customers. They should spend some time, most of it, in the operations of it. But the idea is you're going to leave here with a full understanding of what it is that you do in your business. You're getting something from them, but you're also giving back this knowledge. Now, here are the drawbacks to this thing, and it's primarily one. It's a 12-month, one-time program, okay? You can get a person up here, they can work for you for 12 months. Sometimes they can get a 6-month extension. But once they've done that, they can't do that anymore. They have to go back home and actually apply that knowledge. They don't get to come back year after year the way the H's and the TNs do, okay? So you have to resign yourself to training someone, using them, turning them into a skilled employee, and then saying farewell, sending them back home again. So you really have to sort of build a program around where you've got them coming and going, so you don't have your whole workforce J1s that are going to leave at the same time. You basically want some sort of a incoming and outgoing of this thing. The good news is that it's very economical. Almost the whole cost of this thing is on the employees and not the employer. Now, you may negotiate something more than that, but they're basically paying to learn from you. They're paying for their flights over here. They're paying their subsistence. In theory, they could be paying rent. All of those things, though most successful J1 employers try to meet these guys halfway and make sure they're earning something while they're here. Last year, State Department, Homeland Security, Labor Department, at least in the context of workers coming out of Mexico, bent over backwards to do a good job and to be helpful when they possibly could. Now, some workers they just could not give a visa to unless they had a chance to see them. So they've got a huge backlog of face-to-face interviews. They're finally, catching up with that, and hopefully we'll be back to where they're. What we really hope is they've learned a lesson from this, that face-to-face interviews did not result in workers being any more reliable, dependable, whatever, than the paper interviews did, and won't insist on face-to-face interviews. That we're hoping to have a ongoing visa and interview waiver program that allows them not to have to go to Monterey and go through this whole process, but to do it from their homes. If I had to recommend a program for you for J1 in agriculture, I'd send you to the Ohio State University. They have a top-notch program specifically focused on J1s for agriculture from any number of countries. So if you decide you want to do that, I would just Google Ohio State and J1 and see what they come back to you with. In the case of H2A and H2B, there is no, well, you must carry workman's compensation insurance, which you have to, and you just add these guys to that, okay? If you break that 50 worker threshold for Obamacare, then you have to offer it to the H2A workers as well after they've been there for something like 6 months. Historically, if you reach that point, you offer it to them with some expectation that at least part of the premium is going to be paid for by them. They will universally decline coverage and you're off the hook, okay? And since they eliminated that provision where the IRS is going to fine you if you don't take it, then that really is pretty much the end of it. Now, most of our employers, even though they're not responsible for providing health insurance, are going to cover emergency room expenses or whatever, okay? But the government only expects you to have workers' compensation. And in most cases, if they're a college kid, which a majority of these folks are, then they're still on their parents' policies. They probably have to beef it up a bit for international travel, but they're generally going to be on that. I should say one other thing. I doubt that you guys do it this way, but the intern side of the J1 is 12 months at a pop. If you're actually doing it with kids that are still in school, it can be whenever they're not in school, essentially forever. So they could be working for you their summers, year after year after year, okay, until they finally graduate, and then they're out of it. But that's generally not as helpful to you guys as it would be to some of their employers. Okay, all right, that's kind of it from the perspective of visa programs, but I want to touch on a few things that other people have done. Does anybody that has formed a relationship with an educational institution, probably at the community college or the university level, to have people come out of their programs and work for you. You have some kind of relationship where you're hiring out of their graduating classes. Anybody doing that? We do a lot of business in the nursery and greenhouse industry. And the best example is we've got a large nursery and greenhouse operation near us, one of our first customers, where everybody in that family, and we're talking about 7 brothers, but 3 generations of the family all went to Virginia Tech. So they're very involved with the institution, and they have that institution try to send them good people to work as typically not just grunt workers, but a level above that in their operations. So they're trying to hire from Virginia Tech. But others have actually set up horticulture programs at the local high school or the local community college, and where people will be in school there part of the week and work for you part of the week, things like that. It's something to look at if you've got the right institution geographically proximate. A thing that was really big for a while, got to be less important over time, but I predict may very well start coming back, is working with refugee programs. The first big surge of that was after the Vietnam War, when we brought into this country a whole bunch of what were called Hmongs. They were the mountain people in Southeast Asia that worked with the U.S. against the communists in North Vietnam. And of course, the minute we left Vietnam, they were basically, their lives were forfeit. And so we brought a bunch of those folks over here, established refugee communities for them in various places. And a lot of them have been helpful in agricultural operations. A couple clients of ours up in Ohio used them for a while. It finally got to they were just not close enough. They were spending half a day traveling to get to the work, and it sort of fell apart for those reasons. But it's a thing to think about. If somewhere near you, you have a refugee community, something worth looking at.